Dear friend, if you are a resident of Western Europe, you probably associate World War II with the evil Nazis, the destruction of the Jews, evil Japan, and the attack on Pearl Harbor, the French resistance, and that the Russians were our best allies. Additionally, if you are German, for most of you, 1945 was the year of liberation from the Nazis. This is what social science research states. Such is the current awareness of those times, the times of the cruelest war, caused by Germany. And from my perspective, a Pole whose father was in the hands of German torturers for almost 6 years, this war and what followed was the greatest crime and disgrace of the 20th century. My father first became a prisoner of war, then he was forced into slave labor in northern Germany in a confectioner's store that still exists today, then he was imprisoned and transferred to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, where he was subjected to pseudo-medical experiments, where he was forced to do backbreaking work, where he was starved, and finally, in January 1945, he was forced to march on foot for several dozen kilometers in sub-zero temperatures in a death march to take him with other prisoners deep into Germany. He was liberated by the Americans in May 1945. He survived, and that was the most important thing. Dear friend, I grew up in an atmosphere where the war was not talked about, but you could feel its breath at practically every step. In Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, the effects of the war are felt to this day. Did you know that in 1938, in debt up to its ears as a result of intensive armament, the Third Reich was bankrupt and the only solution was to move forward, that is, to war and looting? Hitler swallowed up Austria, and then the Czech Republic without firing a shot, with the virtually complete silence of European politicians. To help conquer Poland, he invited another bandit, Uncle Joe, as the Americans later affectionately called Stalin, the dictator of Bolshevik Russia. We fought for 5 weeks with 2 invaders, only to capitulate after being betrayed by England and France. The bandits divided Poland in half. Did you know that in 1940, France had the 3rd largest army in the world with 2.5 million soldiers and was supported by the 400,000 strong British Expeditionary Force, and they succumbed to the Germans in almost the same time as Poland, which fought against 2 aggressors, and after 6 weeks, the French formed a collaborationist government with Hitler. Poles were shocked. The occupation began. During the first few weeks, the Germans murdered about 40,000 Polish citizens from a special wanted list. These were, among others, politicians, teachers, doctors, lawyers and students, all those who, according to the Germans, could fuel resistance and be the leaders of the conquered nation. The noble, according to today's German propaganda, German army, the Wehrmacht, pacified hundreds of towns and shot at civilians, including women and children. Special groups of Einsatzkommando terrorized and robbed civilians. Between September 1 and October 26, German forces carried out a total of 764 mass executions of innocent civilians. The Germans did not respect any conventions and laws of war in Poland. The law is on the side of the stronger. This was their directive and Hitler's order. The occupation in France, Belgium or the Netherlands had a completely different dimension. There were no street roundups, no public executions, no civilians died for helping Jews. The Germans did not build extermination camps there. Did you know that just in Poland, as a result of the German occupation, at least 22.2% of all Poles lost their lives, and thus Poland suffered the greatest loss of population of all of the countries in the world? For comparison, 0.8% of Belgians, 1.5% of the French, 0.8% of the English died. Our capital, Warsaw, was razed to the ground by the Germans, who murdered over 200,000 of its 1.3 million inhabitants, and the rest were put into camps or expelled. Paris without firing a shot. According to many opinions, the Germans in Paris only fought for a free place in the café. It was only in Poland that no state institution participated in the extermination of the Jews, and the Polish underground state prepared a report documenting the German persecution of the Jews and presented it to the Allied governments, which did nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop the Germans from exterminating them. Large areas of Poland were annexed to the Reich by the Germans. This is where Konzentrationslager, KL, Auschwitz was built, the largest cemetery in the world, where they had been imprisoning and murdering Poles since 1940, and in 1941, they built Auschwitz II-Birkenau next to it, which also became the place of extermination for Jews, Poles and nations from all over Europe. To this day, we do not know exactly how many people were murdered in this death factory in the cruelest ways, shot in the back of the head, gassed, axe blows, worked to death, starved, phenol injections or diseases. The victims were burned and buried in mass pits. Did you know that, for example, the French government voluntarily deported over 84,000 people to Auschwitz-Birkenau? Jews. That the French authorities took over the property of the people sent to death. In Poland, the Żegota Council to aid Jews was active underground, and Smalkownicy, i.e. those who handed Jews over to the Germans, were punished by death by the underground state. Himmler, on the other hand, praised his French colleagues for their zealous cooperation in the annihilation of the Jews. The part of Poland called the General Government became one huge concentration camp. The population was starved, forced into slave labor and in large numbers, over 5 million, taken to Germany, terrorized by street roundups and public executions. Peasants were forced to give up their produce free of charge, since any disobedience was punishable by death, and pacification of entire villages and towns. 200,000 properties, 8 million hectares of land and 40,000 businesses are confiscated. Industrial plants, and several million people are driven out of their homes. Any help to a Jew, like giving them a piece of bread, not to mention hiding them, is punishable on the spot with death, sometimes of entire families and villages. Tens of thousands of Poles died in this way. A special law was issued for Poles and Jews, in which the lightest punishment was being sent to a camp, and most minor violations faced the death penalty. On the street, a Pole had to take off his hat in front of a German, and Polish women had to curtsy nicely in front of these superhumans. The SS and the Wehrmacht murdered the inhabitants of 2,500 towns in pacifications and kidnapped 200,000 Polish children to be Germanized. Do you know, my friend, that throughout World War II, so for 2076 days, the Germans murdered over 3,000 Polish citizens every day. 2 people died every minute for 6 years. This is more than all the victims of the 2001 attack on New York's World Trade Center towers, every day. Germany acted according to Generalplan Ost, a genocidal program to build a greater Germany on our lands. In 1941, scientists from Humboldt University in Berlin solemnly handed over this plan to Himmler. Systematic, planned looting ensued. Tens of millions of tons of coal, steel and zinc were exported from Poland. The country was stripped of food. Hundreds of thousands of wagons transported everything of value to Germany, from factory equipment, machinery, furniture, etc. to works of art and valuables. Polish gold was stolen and the banking system ruined. To this day, valuable objects and paintings looted in Poland and other countries are discovered in Germany. The Germans burned 90% of books in Poland, priceless monuments of European writing, and stole over 500,000 works of art. In France, Belgium and the Netherlands, the Wehrmacht bought food supplies from farmers while they robbed them in Poland. At that time, Germans were living better than before the war. Taxes for the average citizen did not increase during all those years. The government distributed the spoils of war among citizens, and that is why Hitler enjoyed huge support. More than 2,500 German companies benefited from the slave labor of 13 million forced laborers, slaves, mainly from Poland and Eastern Europe. Can you imagine that today the Germans think that they don't owe us anything? They try to make Poles accomplices of denationalized Nazis, write about Polish concentration camps and knowingly falsify history. Did you know that the judgment of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg in 1946 recognized the occupation of Poland as a war crime, which could not be and was not an occupation in the legal sense of the word, but was an unlawful seizure of someone else's territory by violence and coercion? You must know, dear friend, that Poland came out of the war completely ruined. It also lost 9 to 12 million of its citizens as a result of the change of borders and was set back in its development by generations. 180,000 square kilometers of territory of the Second Polish Republic were taken from us in the east, and 100,000 square kilometers of completely destroyed and plundered country were incorporated. In addition, the governments of the USA and England, unscrupulously, handed over our country for another occupation by Bolshevik Russia. They, like the Germans, murdered our elites completely and ruthlessly robbed us for several generations. One can talk for a long time about the cynicism and cruelty of both occupiers and cases of particular bestiality by both the elites and ordinary Germans. If you are interested, I refer you to the rich literature on the subject, and you can find serious studies on the genocide of Poles online. Already in the 1950s, the Germans settled accounts with the societies of Western Europe and received a 50% reduction in their debts, and the Americans also gave them the Marshall Plan in the amount of $1.5 billion at that time. Today it will be about $50 to $60 billion. To this day, the Germans, who also unleashed World War I, and paid reparations to the Western countries until 2010, do not want to settle accounts with the Poles. Today, Germany makes deals with Namibian tribes, on whom they practiced genocide at the beginning of the 20th century, while with Poland, their neighbor, who experienced their cruelty, they don't even want to start talks about settling accounts for the war. So you see, dear friend, from the lucky part of Europe and America, Poland is still treated brutally and unjustly. And although various German presidents and chancellors have recently publicly apologized to us, any phrases about dignity, justice and solidarity are just empty and meaningless words in the mouth of German politicians. Remember, my friend, the German state has been trying to change the facts about the war and their guilt since the 1950s and propagates a completely revisionist narrative. If you are German and you are reading these words, you are probably a sensitive and curious person. You know that what I'm describing happened and nothing can change that. But we the people, Poles, Germans, Americans or Japanese, can live in friendship and cooperate harmoniously for the good of ourselves, our families and countries. All we have to do is to mobilize our political elites to curb their exuberant ambitions or lust for dominion over others. What is also needed, as in our case, is a rational and fair assessment of the past and, if possible, an attempt to repair the harm done, so that we can look calmly into the future. I believe you will agree with me. All the best.